There are no limits.
It figures it would be something like this.
Our nation, our ideal of vision.
Excuse
We don't want
me.
to just survive.
You
We
know,
want to
you look like your head
succeed.
fell on the cheese dip back in 1957. You're okay. This one, real fucking ugly. You see, I take these glasses off, she looks like a regular person, doesn't she, huh? Put them back on, formaldehyde face. That's what we got.
That's enough out of you. You get out or I call the cops.
Call the cops. You know what you need? You need a Brazilian plastic surgeon.
I've got one that can see.
He's a tall Caucasian male, doesn't appear armed, wearing sunglasses.
I don't like this one bit. Not one bit.
Good morning everyone out there. It is well, it's not a great morning in terms of weather, but it's a beautiful morning in terms of, really feeling like, starting to gain some traction in terms of, gain some ground with this fight, right? I honestly believe, and I said it to myself from the beginning when, all this happened and we're starting to get smashed from more protesting and stuff. And I said, you know what? The key to this is understanding their legislation and finding out where they're not following their own rules and throwing it back in their faces. And the more I've been, and I'm going to use the term loosely, balls deep in legislation, right? The more I'm finding just how much of a joke these guys are in terms of how they're doing things. They're blatantly disregarding all of their rules, and they're just going on under the premise that people are stupid, and our silence towards us not saying anything towards these actions are their consent so they can continue doing it. But I found some stuff last night. I couldn't believe it. I came across, I did a post about it where it talks about, a clause within the omnibus bill where it talks about they want to be able to have this. They wanted to create this this section that allows Victoria Police to be recognised as authorised officers. And I'm like, hang on a sec. What do you mean? What do you mean be recognised as? Aren't they already recognised as? Isn't that why they've been able to ask people, demand people's name and address pursuant to Section 200 of the Public Health and Wellbeing Act that they like to rattle off, or pursuant to the powers under Section 190 that they like to rattle off and act like they are, given all these powers, when in the legislation it says authorised officer. So hang on. So all of these sections you're rattling off and saying to the people pursuant to Section 200, you must give me your name and address under subsection D or whatever else you're saying, you're full of shit because you're not an authorised officer according to your own legislation. I couldn't believe it, right? And I put up a question yesterday on Facebook, and then I spoke to Jaden O'Connor and I found the section under the Public Administrations Act which discounted police being authorised officers under that act. And then under Section 30 of the Public Health and Wellbeing Act, subsection 1, it says that the Secretary may appoint an authorised officer as defined in Chapter 3 or whatever of the Public Administration Act. So I've gone and had a look, and they aren't allowed to be. They aren't allowed to be. I couldn't believe it. I could not believe it. So basically, and unless someone can prove me wrong here, according to what I've read and how I've looked it up, they're not authorised officers. I couldn't believe it. So I'm like, all of these things you're going around doing, requesting, telling people to give you their name and address under Section 200 and all this shit that you think you're doing. Detain people, stop people from leaving an area and all these other things that authorised officers are allowed to do. It's for authorised officers. I couldn't believe it. I honestly couldn't believe it. So what I've learnt is if you want to have true power, guys, if you want to truly feel empowered, it's not getting pickets and guys standing fucking toe to toe with the police who are just completely brainwashed and don't even know their own rules. It's understand their rules, all of them. Consume yourself within their own legislation, so you can, so then you know and you're empowered that, you know, when these guys are acting within their own rules, you can go, well, sorry, according to this, you shouldn't be doing this. So, you know, it was very, very interesting, and it just made my night last night. I stayed up to about, I don't know, 12:30 at night, maybe 1 o'clock in the morning, just reading. Right, I haven't watched my TV in bloody 3 days, man. In 3 days, I haven't gone near the couch. I've been just looking at legislation flat out, reading, cross-referencing. Yeah, so you want to feel empowered? That's the way to do it. You want to feel powerful, you want to feel like you have the ability to challenge something? That's the way to do it. Throw this shit back in their faces. The fact they're not even following their own rules makes me sick. The fact they're not even following their own rules that they've written, let me get this right. So they are meant to enforce the law but not follow the law themselves. They are meant to enforce these rules of the legislation, but they're not meant to follow these rules themselves. Right? Unbelievable. What? My speaker isn't working. Jose, you smart ass. Jose, good to see you, mate. Yeah, so it's very, very interesting, and yeah, I couldn't believe it. I'm gonna really delve deep into it today. I can't wait to actually get home and get back to it, and you know, really look into. I've just been, you know, the whole thing's just a joke.
Away from all this other nonsense, there are issues at the centre of this coronavirus response which can't be ignored. The two most prominent are, in the first instance, the expectation from governments that we will or should surrender to each and every of their totalitarian dictates. For months now, we've been ordered to do X and Y with not one syllable of evidence to validate the orders. And this betrays every known precept of what is just, which dates back centuries. The principle of habeas corpus, we learnt that at school, means if you're going to detain someone, you have to provide to a court a valid reason for that person's detention. Habeas corpus, you must produce the body. For months, we've been given no valid reasons as to why we can't leave our home, even now, why we can't go to a bar and we can't stand up. Why we can go to a wedding but only the bride and groom are allowed on the dance floor. Why you can go to the beach in summer but preferably not at midday, and you have to be at least the length of a towel away from the next person. And if not, presumably, you'll be arrested. Under habeas corpus, what is the valid reason for these dictatorial edicts? Which brings us to the second point, and that is the total denial of freedom inherent in all of this. I, for one, Alan Jones, am not prepared to accept that because Daniel Andrews says so, or Gladys Berejiklian, or Anastasia Palaszczuk, or even Scott Morrison, just because they order us, does that mean they are right? Where is the evidence? I've called for a national advertising campaign to enable us to be told the truth. Why has not one politician ever told the nation that 99% of cases are mild? Why have these freedoms been stolen from us now, but they weren't during a world war? Here we are in peacetime, being denied the very values that people went to war to protect. Are we going to let these dictators get away with this? That's what Donald Trump was on about last week when he talked about toxic propaganda and ideological poison that, quote, if not removed, will dissolve the civic bonds which tie us together, unquote. Well, everything in the last month's been about keeping us apart. Donald Trump spoke again, quote, scaring you out of speaking the truth and bullying Americans into abandoning their values, their heritage and their very way of life, unquote. Which prompts the question, I suppose, what are we going to do about it?
High Court likely to free COVID's political prisoners. The Australian, the 23rd of September 2020, by Mirko Bagaric. The High Court is likely to rule the arrest of the Victorian freedom protesters in recent weeks was constitutionally illegal. The freedom of assembly is not absolute, but neither should any important freedom be absolutely abrogated. That is why the High Court is likely to rule the arrest of the Victorian freedom protesters in recent weeks was constitutionally illegal, meaning that Australia has witnessed the detention of its first political prisoners. These are defined as people who are deprived of their liberty solely because of their non-violent freedom of peaceful assembly and association. The overreach by the Victorian government in forcibly detaining everyday people who disagree with its approach of carpet bombing the economy and civil rights to flatten the COVID-19 curve has stunned almost everyone. Internationally, some now see Australia as a human rights pariah, and we may be shamed into silence when it comes to lecturing other countries on human rights abuses in the future. Fortunately, there is a likely remedy for the unprecedented assault on freedoms in Victoria. The Constitution contains the right to freedom of assembly. Victoria cannot override that. The High Court, in a series of cases in the early 1990s, implied the existence of a number of rights from the democratic and representative framework of the Constitution. In Australian Capital Television Pty Limited v Commonwealth, the court held that Australians had the freedom of political communication. In a number of other subsequent decisions, numerous judges have held that the freedom of association is a necessary incident of the freedom of communication, given that the ability to communicate is contingent upon people being able to gather together. Mulholland v Australian Electoral Commission. The High Court has expressly noted that implied freedoms can be limited, but only if restrictions are reasonably appropriate and adapted to serve a legitimate objective in a manner consistent with representative and responsible government. This is where arresting lockdown protesters becomes questionable. In order for a total ban on demonstrations to be justified, the Victorian government would need to show that this is proportionate to the ends of mitigating the harm caused by COVID-19. While it is established that the best way to limit infections is to break the chain of infection, the jurisprudential equation is not one-sided. It is also necessary to look at the damage caused by a total ban on freedom of assembly. This is where exhortations that we need to defeat the virus and we must follow the rules by Premier Daniel Andrews might not be enough. The High Court is likely to be far more influenced by the scientific observation from Victorian Chief Health Officer Brett Sutton that the likelihood of spreading the virus is 20 times less outdoors than indoors. And international responses will be relevant. Much has been learned about the risk assessment calculus. No other developed country barricades its citizens in order to deal with the pandemic. They understand the health, economic and social side effects are too burdensome, nor do they crack down, other than in China, as hard on those who would protest the lockdown. Even if it is permissible to restrict gatherings, it does not mean an absolute ban on them is acceptable. The limitation should go only as far as necessary. If, for example, protesters were required to wear masks, remain 2 meters apart and register before attending a protest, it is likely this would facilitate the exercise of the constitutional freedom without materially increasing the spread of the virus. A protest need not mean a rabble, it can be orderly and controlled. Neither will the atmospherics be lost on the High Court. Victorian Police Command has taken an eccentric approach to dealing with the protesters. Rather than objectively enforcing the law, it refers to them as the tinfoil hat-wearing brigade. You might expect it from one of Andrews's ministers, but never from an independent executive branch of government. Their unalloyed hypocrisy in not arresting even one of the 10,000 Black Lives Matter protesters, while hunting down freedom protesters, will undermine the Victorian government's case that all protests need to be banned. It also won't be missed by the High Court that the freedom protesters have been law-abiding Victorians leading responsible lives. Their only crime is that they prefer freedom to non-freedom, unless there is a demonstrated need for the restrictions. Has an offender ever been less blameworthy? What is less in dispute is that the rule of law in Victoria is broken. Regularly in recent years, it is only intervention by the High Court that has shone a light on dark cases, including Lawyer Capital X and George Pell, in Victoria. Nonetheless, it seems the Andrews government still sees itself as having some immunity from the core principles of democracy and the rule of law. Fortunately for Victorians, High Court judges can cross the ring of steel and see justice done in their state.